how has my trauma from my childhood, my teenagehood, or even my former relationships in adulthood, how has that impacted negatively my current relationship or relationships? You have to have that self-awareness to say, this is not just some random relationship I've entered into, and this is not it's not becoming unhealthy randomly. It's because I am not healed. I have brought my trauma into this relationship, and either it's causing me to manipulate the relationship and become the abuser. A victim of trauma abuse can also become an abuser. Or I don't know how to recognize what is healthy. I'm allowing more abuse to be perpetrated on me, and I'm getting re-traumatized.
Welcome everyone. Today we have Dr. Vani Marshall back on the podcast. As most of you know, Dr. Marshall is a cognitive therapist with a doctorate in counseling and a master's in psychology. She is also an evangelist and missionary with a passion to help people. In this episode, Dr. Marshall discusses her work in Kuala Lumpur. She delves into the concept of abuse trauma, explaining its symptoms and effects on individuals, how we can recognize it and offer support. She also highlights the importance of parenting on healthy emotional development for our children, the necessity of breaking the cycle of abuse, and much more. Well, welcome to the podcast. It's good to have you back on, Sister Marshall. It's been a while.
Yes, it's so great to be back. It's been a while because it's my fault. I've been just traveling and being busy with so many things, but it's so good to be back on Heka.
Yeah, we've had people wondering, when's she going to be back? When's Dr. Marshall going to be back on? I'm like, well, it's up to her. She's the talent. I'm just the conduit, you know? We just try to make it happen.
Oh no, you're gifted. I'm just very happy to connect with Heka Podcast and with you again.
So how are you doing? You're in Malaysia again at the moment, right? I think our last recording you were actually in Malaysia, and then you were in the States for a while, and now
right.
Yep.
I was in the States for a while, and I've come back to Malaysia. I am planting a fellowship here in the central part of the capital city, Kuala Lumpur. And really, it is a emotional and mental wellness gathering, a mental wellness fellowship where people, men and women, teens, anybody, is welcome to come. And what I do is I go through a series, very much like our podcast. I go through a series of teachings and on mental wellness, getting better mental health. And also through that, I insist to those that come to this group that you cannot really have good spiritual health without mental health. You cannot pursue spiritual health or actually achieve spiritual health without emotional wellness. And so it is all three. It's mental wellness, emotional wellness, and spiritual wellness given through the truth of that there is a God. He loves us. He wants us to be better. He wants us to be spiritually strong. He wants us to be emotionally and mentally strong. And that's it. Well-adjusted, functioning adults in our community.
Wow, that's awesome. So how long have you all been gathering?
I started the fellowship really last May.
Okay.
And so this May will be a year. So, and it's grown. It started with just one or two people, and it is grown. It's multiplied, to a whole bunch of people. And almost every Sunday mornings, Sunday noon, really, we serve lunch. To whoever comes, they grab a plate, they grab some lunch, and then they sit around or they sit wherever they want. And we start our teaching and our session. And it's just been so fabulous. I've met some of the most wonderful people in this group, and really we've become like a family. And,
Mm.
So whenever I return to the States for, say, a month or 2 months, I miss them terribly because we've become a family, and they've shared their most deepest, intimate feelings and struggles in the group, because it is towards achieving better mental health, better spiritual health. So they are very transparent. And now they become even more transparent as we are growing in relationship and in trust with one another. So yeah, they're great, great group of people. And I'm hoping now they follow Hacker Podcast. Many of them, they follow Hacker Podcast. They watch the YouTube channel that you started and you manage for me. I always tell them, look, my social media, actually, it is the owner of Hacker Podcast is a busy person, but Greg manages it, and I'm very thankful for his input. He takes care of it, and the Instagram post. There will be no Instagram without Greg. So they have followed Hacker Podcast. They follow me on YouTube. They follow the videos on Instagram as well, and the YouTube channel. Many of them that come to this fellowship, they're like, oh, the reason we're here is because we follow you on social media. So we just want to see you as, live.
Wow, that's so cool.
Yeah, incredible.
That's
So,
awesome.
and well, I'm inviting you to come and speak at this fellowship whenever you can. You and Stephanie need to come to Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. And it's a beautiful city,
Oh,
great
yes, it
food,
is. Yeah.
and great, great people. I really love it here. And if you come, oh my goodness, most of the group will know you already.
That would be awesome. We went there a couple years ago, because I think we were in Singapore, and then we went over to Malaysia for a
Right.
few days and ministered at one of the churches there, and traveled into Kuala Lumpur for the day. And oh, what a city! It
I know,
is
amazing. Now
amazing. Yeah.
people don't think that Malaysian capital city is it's like a big city, but you could compare it to Houston, or
Oh
it's some
yeah,
of the big
yeah.
cities back in the United States. It's very, very beautiful, very busy. Traffic jams all over the place, but it's a great city to visit, and I love it here.
Yeah. You're mentioning to me the other day that there's opportunity for people to partner with you when it comes to supporting the work there. Would you mind sharing how people, if they want to support what you're doing there in Kuala Lumpur,
You
how they
know,
can get behind it?
yes, thank you, Greg, for that. The fellowship that I've started does need support. Um, the location, as well as, we serve lunch, we have resources for them, so that we do need support for that. So any kind of financial donation per month that can come in, anything, any amount is appreciated. And they can either, I'm not sure, how do they contact me? I guess they can contact me on my Instagram page. On my
Yeah.
Instagram page, right on top of my Instagram page is the link for my Venmo account, and they can use Venmo. Or if the support is coming from the United States, they can Zelle me, or whatever, Venmo, PayPal, Zelle. They can contact me, or they can maybe even contact Hacker Podcast for further
Yeah.
information. And
Yeah.
I'm sure Greg,
Any of that works. Yeah.
yes, then Greg will be happy to tell you how to send in the support, for which myself and the EHF Emotional Health Fellowship, EHF Fellowship, will be eternally grateful for your blessing.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Greg, for that opportunity to share that.
Well, yeah, you've been such a blessing to us, and it'd be a good opportunity for the audience to show you a bit of support. So you can message, I'll put the links and info in the description of this podcast and on YouTube.
Thanks, sir.
You'll be able to see it there, but you can message us on Instagram and we respond. So reach out if you'd like to support. And we're excited for what you're doing over there and what God's doing
Thank
through
you.
you in Kuala Lumpur.
Thank you. Or they can even email me. You can put my email
Oh,
address.
yes. Yep,
It's
that's
it,
right.
it's already out there anyway, so they can email me. Whoever it is, whichever part of the world you're watching this, and you want to be part of emotional and spiritual help support group fellowship. You want to be part of that. You want to be part of people coming to the knowledge of health and God. Please um, uh, email me, drop me a note, and I will get back to you very
Yeah,
quickly.
awesome. Well, we're excited to have you back on, and those of you who've listened to the pod for a while and a number of these episodes with Dr. Marshall, typically how we do this is I throw it over to you, you introduce the topic, and then we discuss it back and forth with you leading the discussion. So, Dr. Marshall, the floor is yours to introduce what we'll be talking about here today.
Thank you. Greg and I were in conversation on what areas that I could just start resuming our podcast in. And one of the areas, and there's a series of topics that I actually discussed with Greg, but one of the topics that has been sort of on the top of my mind, or really on my heart, and it's possible because I'm counseling and have counseled many people that have struggled with this, and that is abuse trauma.
Mm.
And what is abuse trauma? Sometimes those two words are not seen together very often. It's either abuse or trauma. Abuse trauma is trauma, very simply, trauma as a result of persistent abuse. It could be mental abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, verbal abuse, any kind of abuse that produces or accumulated abuse is obviously going to produce some trauma. And my premise is that there is a way out of abuse trauma. When I say out, meaning you can overcome it with good therapy, with awareness, and of course with healing, with supernatural healing. You can overcome anything really with supernatural healing.
Mm.
But the question that I ask, or I'm going to start off asking in this particular segment, is that if you've ever struggled with unhealthy fear of being abandoned, now this is what I'm going to do. For the first few minutes, I would like to talk about the symptoms of abuse trauma so that people listening to this podcast will know, well, do I have it, or does somebody I know have it? How do you recognize somebody has abuse trauma, somebody's struggling with that? Whether in your place of worship or at home with your family or your friends or colleagues at work. If somebody that you know, or even yourself, you are constantly fearful of being abandoned, either abandoned by God or fearful of being abandoned by someone you care about, abandoned by a spouse, abandoned by your children. I'm not talking about a momentary feeling of, oh, they're going to leave me. No, I'm talking about a consistent, paralyzing fear of being abandoned, or in order not to be abandoned, they put themselves under a lot of pressure and condemnation to be a perfect Christian or a perfect good person. And they deal harshly with themselves. They are very harsh with themselves. They beat themselves up every time they make a small mistake, every time they mess up. Chances are, I'm not saying it's always abuse trauma in this case, but chances are they have been abused and they are still struggling with the trauma of that abuse. And that is just the I would say the tip of the iceberg on how to recognize abuse trauma. There is a whole slew of symptoms of when a person acts out, and I'm going to do that right now. Now, of course, there is a healthy fear of God. We need to fear God. That's a healthy fear. But I'm not talking about a healthy fear. I'm talking about a very negative, unhealthy fear of being abandoned by someone you love, abandoned by people, abandoned. God himself has forgotten you. And, there is one thing that often hardwires us for self-defeating thoughts that I'm not good enough. So you enter into a relationship thinking already that you're not good enough. That's a self-defeating thought. The moment you're already entering into a new relationship, already in grace position. Grace position. This relationship is going to crash and I'm going to receive the impact of that crash. So you enter into the relationship in brace position. You cannot survive in brace position the rest of your life. It'll juice you out. I mean, it'll drain you. But there is one thing that often hardwires us for these kind of self-defeating behaviors, behaviors that often hinder our faith, behaviors that causes us to act unrighteously towards other people, behaviors that are just not acceptable even in society. And this one thing that hardwires you to continue to self-defeat yourself is abuse. If you've been abused, it is you will struggle with self-defeating thoughts. In this particular segment, I would like to also consider how abuse throughout our lives. Again, I repeat that I'm talking about abuse that has happened throughout our lives, or at least for a number of years in our lives. Whether it's childhood abuse, or whether it started when you were a teenager, or whether the abuse started when you were an adult, or the abuse started after you were married. Whatever it is, if it is a number of years of abuse, then you will be suffering, or you will struggle with abuse trauma. And as I said, we will consider how abuse that is an ongoing, or abuse that is happening for several years, it will affect the way, number one, it'll affect the way we view God. It'll affect our perception. That our perception will be he's not a very kind or loving God. In any time, he's just there to trip me up. He's just there to count how many mistakes I make and trip me up. He's not interested in caring or loving me and caring for me. I just saw a flash of lightning at the back there. Oh my goodness. That's making this podcast quite exciting.
It's very dramatic.
Very dramatic. And also, number one, it will affect the way we view God, but it'll also affect how we treat other people and how we treat ourselves. We won't self-care. Victims of abuse trauma, or people struggling with abuse trauma, don't care much about themselves. They will be too busy knocking themselves out, taking care of highly demanding people in their lives, just so that the relationship will be intact, and just so these people won't abandon them. So they get into a codependent state, and we talked about codependency before. People struggling with abuse trauma can very easily enter into a codependent relationship. They have a propensity to become codependent because they say, well, if I fix every one of, this person's problem, whether it's my spouse's problem, my son's problem, my friend's problem, they'll never leave me. I'll always be needed. They'll always need me. And that is actually a symptom of abuse trauma, that you feel the necessity to fix and to rescue people, not because necessarily that you even love them or care for them in a healthy way. It's only because you don't want them to abandon you. That's not healthy at all. People who come into our lives sometimes do leave our lives. It is what it is. That's life. Some people who come into our lives, some people sometimes leave our lives. And it's not only through death or whatever. They could leave our lives because they don't want to have a relationship with it anymore. And so it is sad when you lose a good friend or a spouse, or a child your child doesn't want to have anything to do with you anymore. It is sad. But victims of abuse trauma, what they will do is they will manipulate that relationship because they want those people, they don't want to give those people the freedom to leave. They want those people to continue to need them. So that, in a way, becomes a codependent thing. Now, I do believe that I've mentioned this a couple of times in other segments or other podcasts that we've done together, Greg. But childhood is the prime time for brain development. Childhood is the prime time for brain development. You don't have to be a psychologist to know that. That's when your brain is developing. And it develops way into late teens, even early adulthood. And this is the time where people, the child typically learns to have healthy attachments with the child's parents, the child's dad, the child's mom, siblings, other people outside of the immediate family. It's during this developmental stage that the child learns to have healthy attachments and a stable sense of love and security. However, when a person experiences something traumatic during childhood, there's abuse, it breaks that bridge of connection between the child and the abuser. I mean, for example, if the child had a connection with the abuser was a parent, which is very sad, or a sibling, a grandparent, a stepfather. If the child did come into this world thinking that, hey, there's a bridge here, I can trust this person, but the abuse breaks that bridge. The child, when that child, or even moving on from children, if a teenager, even a child, adolescent, teenager, young adult, when a person experiences something continuously traumatic during their childhood, it will actually interrupt brain development in a healthy way. The healthy brain development would be interrupted. And immediately, when brain development is interrupted, it skews the sense of what is healthy in a relationship. The child then does not know anymore what is healthy. What do I expect in a healthy relationship? How should the other person behave towards me in a healthy relationship? If I know how they should behave towards me, then great, I will expect that. And if that doesn't happen, I won't put up with unhealthy behaviors in my life. I won't put up with the other person behaving in an abusive, unhealthy way with me, because I know what a healthy relationship looks like. But when trauma interrupts the way a child's brain develops, that brain development is interrupted, and the child's expectation of what healthy looks like, what a healthy relationship looks like, is skewed. The child no longer knows. Or if the teenager used to know, then again, the teenager will get into a place in their brain. The brain development is interrupted now. The teenager will then begin to actually, sadly, reevaluate what is healthy and what is not in a negative sense, meaning, oh, well, maybe this is normal. Maybe abuse is normal. Maybe people who have authority over me, maybe they have the right to put me down once a week. Or maybe they have the right to abuse me. Maybe they have the right to not encourage me and not give me good self-esteem. Maybe they have the right to continue to insult me. So our sense of what is healthy, our sense of what is unhealthy is messed up. Every person in this world, every person, and we all are created by God, and we deserve to have a healthy, loving relationships that we can trust. I deserve to have a healthy relationship in my life that I can rely on for support throughout my life. I think that's God's will for me to have healthy relationships in my life that I can actually depend on. I'm talking about on this planet. I'm not talking about our spiritual relationship with God. I'm talking about our relationship with people, that I need to be able to trust the people in my circle. I don't have to trust everybody in this world, but in my circle that I have allowed them in my world, my goodness, it's not abnormal to expect me to trust them. I need to be able to trust them. I need to be able to rely on, my spouse. Of course, he's passed away, but I could always rely on him. He supported me throughout his entire life. I mean, well, not entire life. From the time we were married, from the time we met and then married and then until he passed away, I always felt that I could rely on him, depend on him. In fact, I could rely on him, not just felt it, but I did rely on him, did depend on him in a healthy way, and did trust him. He never let me down. And none of us are perfect. He wasn't perfect, but he never let me down. I could trust him.
Right.
I felt I deserved that, though. And he deserved the same thing. He deserved a spouse, a wife that he could lean on and rely on, and who would bless him and who would be there for him and support him. Um, you know, actually for most of his adult life.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what happened. But it doesn't always happen to everybody. If a young adult gets married, few years, they're wonderful. It's, they're happy, and then abuse starts. If one spouse begins to abuse the other spouse, verbally, physically, mentally, emotionally abuse that person, even if they are no more a child when the abuse started, they can still suffer and struggle with trauma as a result of the abuse. So I have counseled women. In fact, I've counseled even men that have been abused. Sometimes when we talk about marital abuse, automatically we think it is the man who's the abuser and the woman is the victim. It may have been the case where that was the truth, that most of the time it is the man is the abuser. But it's I've counseled men that have been abused, mentally, emotionally, and verbally, financially abused. I'm counseling somebody right now, in the last few months that the husband is the one being abused.
Yeah, I think it's because when we hear the word abuse, especially in the context of adults, so with children it's different, but when you think about the context of adults or even a marriage, when you hear the word abuse, typically your mind goes straight to physical.
Yeah.
And so the assumption is that if there's abuse in a marriage, then it's a man abusing a woman. And as you laid out there, there's other types of abuse, not just physical.
Absolutely, Greg. And that's a good point that you brought out. We typically think of abuse as physical. And it does include physical. Very sad. But let me tell you what is even more damaging. And I'm not diminishing the danger of physical abuse at all. Physical abuse is terrible. And that is why it's criminal. Right. There are criminal sanctions against it because it's physical. But in so many ways, at so many levels, what is even more damaging is emotional abuse. Mental and emotional abuse has long-lasting effects. Long after the broken bone has been healed and the broken door has been repaired, you carry the scars of emotional and mental abuse for years and years, and that which is exactly why there is this particular issue these days, more and more so, called abuse trauma. Abuse trauma is not just physical abuse. It's a result of continuous mental, emotional, verbal, and even sexual abuse. I know that there might be legal penalties for certain amount of verbal abuse and all of that, but I'm not sure whether there's a great legal penalty for emotional abuse, because they're really maybe not a criminal penalty. There might be civil penalties, but emotional abuse is, first of all, it's difficult to measure emotional abuse. Mm-hmm. Unless you have to go to court for a decree, a divorce or a separation, then you can bring a doctor in to say, well, yes, this is the symptoms and the effects of emotional abuse on my client, and that is why this and that. That's more civil, but
sometimes they don't even recognize it, because it's all encompassing, and unless they're exposed with a proper relationship or a proper marriage, which I'm sure you'll get to throughout this discussion. But if they're not exposed to that, they may not even understand that they are being abused.
Right. And verbal and emotional abuse does not have to be just a spouse screaming at the other spouse. Because if you're a public nuisance, then there are criminal penalties, and you can be arrested for being a public nuisance because you're shouting at the top of your voice. Your neighbors are being bothered and everything. And so that could have this. But then what if you are quietly and silently emotionally manipulating and mentally manipulating your spouse, and you're abusing that spouse emotionally and mentally? How do you call the cops on that person? What do you do? So at least for physical abuse, there are some ways to perhaps even stop it, because there are laws of the land. But continuous emotional and mental and verbal abuse that is done quietly behind closed doors,
Mm.
very seldom somebody is going to handcuff you and take you to the local county jail because, somehow you call somebody and said, well, he's manipulating me.
Yeah. Well, I attended a church for a number of years, and after I left and was going to another one, it came out that the pastor had been abusing the family in a number of different ways. But I mean, you would have never guessed that. Uh, just attending, like he was our pastor, so
Right.
you
And
obviously would not expect that.
right. And because of the stigma, I'm in Asia right now. And there is a great need for emotional wellness. And there's a greater awareness in Asian nations for better mental health and better emotional health. And I'm so thankful that people want to be better mentally. But those days, there was a great stigma. If you were being abused by a spouse or by your children, you're not going to, and not just in Asia, even in America, there's a stigma not to speak about it to a lot of people. So we pretend that the relationship is healthy and going well when it's not.
Mm.
So self-care is very important. Like I said, when brain development, going back to brain development, when that's interrupted, a survivor, and I use the word survivor advisedly, because they are, if they're still alive after years of abuse, they're a survivor of a wreck. A survivor of childhood abuse, trauma, or neglect. Neglect is abuse. If you keep neglecting your if you neglect your small child, that's criminal, and there are criminal penalties. But you can also neglect other people in your lives that are adults. There's elder abuse these days, not just these days. There's been elder abuse for a long time. What if you neglect them and leave them to their own devices 8 hours a day, and they cannot even walk or move or feed themselves? They are bedridden, and you just neglect them, and they're just lying there with bed sores. That's abuse. Now that does have criminal penalties for elder abuse and for neglect. But there are people in our society that actually depend on us. The elderly and the very young. The very young and the very elderly are the most vulnerable. And they are abused. And do you know that there's a great deal of trauma that the elderly go through that they never talk about? There's a stigma if they say, well, my children are abusing me. I don't want to get my son into trouble, but he's really abusing me. So and it continues. It's some of these cases are so horrifying. I'm not even sure how much I want to share in podcasts and just upset everybody who watches it. It'll be traumatic for the viewer to see this. But a survivor of childhood abuse, trauma, and neglect, they indeed will have a very hard time forming healthy relationships because of their negative perceptions of the people who had hurt them in the past. They are then now are not able to form healthy relationship because they think that, well, all people are going to hurt me because in my past people have hurt me. That means I am not worthy. I am not important enough to love unconditional. I'm not worthy enough to be loved or respected unconditionally. And so, they will accept abuse. I've noticed that, and I've counseled clients before. They'll marry somebody, and that person turns out to be abusive. They will leave that relationship. They'll either get divorced or separated from that relationship, and then they will marry somebody else. They think that this time it's going to be better, but there is a pattern that victims or survivors of abuse trauma, the pattern is they keep getting attracted to abusive people. That means they will leave an abusive situation, they will leave an abusive marriage only to remarry another abusive person. What is that? Surely you will look at the new person and there will be, stop signs. They'll be, that's a red stop sign. Oh, that's a That's a
Yeah.
big red
A
stop sign, bigger than this
a red
room.
flag. Yeah.
As they get to know this person, surely they will be triggered by, you will expect the person that's been abused, and people abused are triggered all the time. They're triggered by, oh, I don't like the way, because you remind me of my ex. You remind me of my father, my stepfather who abused me. I do not, you would think they would run away from a potentially abusive relationship. Instead, they are attracted to it. Now, not all survivors of abuse trauma, not all survivors of abuse trauma are attracted continuously to more and more abusive relationships. Some of them will recognize it and they will come away good. But many will enter into a new relationship that is abusive. They are attracted. I'll tell you where that's coming from. In their core, because of the childhood trauma or even adult trauma, we talked about childhood trauma, but a woman who is married to an abuser and the abuse in her life, the abuse actually started after her marriage. That's not childhood trauma. That's adult trauma. She's being traumatized in that marriage. That trauma can make her really believe. Remember, I said self-defeating beliefs? That trauma will leave her with many self-defeating. She will become hardwired. Even if it's just a few years of marriage, the brain will be hardwired to believe that she's not worthy of better treatment. She deserves that. There must be something wrong with her to put up with that. So then, when she meets this new person, she divorces this guy. She leaves. That means must have been some flash of understanding or illumination for her to leave them. There must have been some desire to protect herself, right? She leaves them. She gets into another relationship, could be months down the road, a year, 2 years down the road, and that she puts up with the same treatment because she is hardwired already to think that she deserves the abuse.
Mm.
It's incredible. I was about to say there's so much in this in this topic of abuse trauma, so much. I want to also do not just how to detect symptoms of a trauma victim or an abuse victim or whatever, a survivor of abuse trauma. How can you say that they are? How do you tell? How do you discern it, define it? But I also want to talk about what to do in order to protect themselves from future re-traumatization. There's such a word as re-traumatization. You're supposed to come out and heal. But when you come out and you begin to develop unhealthy relationships, those potential toxic relationships can re-traumatize you. And I want to talk about that, but not in this segment. So I guess like Greg and I, we always have a part 1, part 2, and I always tell Greg, you know what part 2 means? It means that I just didn't finish my notes. That's all it means.
Yeah. Didn't have enough time.
Yeah, I didn't have enough time. I know that we don't want our segments to go too long. We want people to be able to watch it and not, let it drag out. People have lives to live. But I would really like to do another segment on abuse trauma that would encompass what re-traumatizing means, and why do people who leave an abusive relationship, they have this pattern of going into another abusive relationship because they somehow think that this time it's going to be different. This time, this new guy or this new girl in my life, she's not going to treat me that way. He's not going to do that to me. This time it's going to be different, and it's not. As I said, this is not across the board. It's not every survivor of abuse trauma enters into a second abusive relationship or a third or a fourth. It's not always like that. Many times it is. There is a pattern that I've seen over and over again. Just within my counseling practice, I've seen this. I also want to talk about in the next segment, difficulty. Why do survivors of abuse trauma, they have difficulty regulating emotions, and what to do about it? What can we do about regulating? Let's not, okay, we can recognize that we have difficulty regulating emotions, what do I do about it now? Where do I
Mm.
go? How do I get help? How do I regulate it? Borderline personality disorders, narcissistic personality disorders, many times are a result of unhealed abuse trauma. But borderline personality and narcissistic personality, they don't just suddenly occur in adulthood. They are occurring in childhood. Usually it starts presenting itself by the age of maybe 10, 11, 12. That's when you notice the child is just, acting up different, whatever. That child has been subject to abuse since the child was a baby or a toddler at the age of 10, 11, or 12, or maybe even in teens, in teenagehood, adolescent. The symptoms of borderline personality disorder, symptoms of a narcissistic personality disorder, or even histrionic personality disorder. These are all similar disorders. They're almost like twins. BPD, NPD, HPD are like triplets, but with certain differences. Certain
Mm.
differences. So they present at the age as young as 10, 11, 12, or maybe in the mid-teens, late teens, they begin to present some of this, what I've told you: low self-esteem, low self-worth, a lot of anger, an inability to regulate emotions, living a very risque life. They will
Mm.
have some kind of they'll take risks that nobody knows about because they want to push the boundary in their life, see how far they can, and they have a pattern of coming out of unhealthy relationship only to go into another unhealthy relationship, toxic,
And
abusive relationship. So I'd like to talk about all of that. Maybe we could do another segment.
yeah, yeah. I think the information that you shared today is helpful, and there's a bit more you're going to talk about, but it's helpful in um, identifying it, I guess, within yourself if you've never dealt with anything and you're always wondering why. But I think it also gives the listeners the opportunity to have empathy for people who are going through this, that they're not just othered or I can't understand them or why do they do that, but there's a bit of empathy that, I'm better understanding why this is taking place. I did have a quick question, and it might be, um, I don't know, it might not be useful, but I was wondering if some of the things you were just talking about there, could that be the result of, like, say, a split home from a very early age? So I know you talked about abuse, but is that like a type of abuse, is like neglect when you have a split home?
A home that is split. I gather that the meaning, your meaning is that if the parents have divorced or they are
Yeah,
separated for some reason, and the child has to either accept a new person coming into the home, a stepfather, stepmother, or the child is raised by a single parent because there's divorce. Okay.
yeah,
Um, a lot of people don't like to call that abuse. They call it um uh you know it is trauma, though. It is trauma. It may not be trauma as a result of abuse unless there was separate incidences of abuse before the split
right.
happened. If there was abuse, that's fine. But even though that's not abuse trauma, living in a split home, losing your dad moves out, or your mother moves out, or your mother starts a relationship with somebody else, and you've got to now get to know the new step parent or the new partner, and it is traumatic for a child. And so even though it's not a typical abuse situation, the split itself, I wouldn't I wouldn't call it abuse, but it is, in many ways, it's traumatic because of the abandonment that is involved there. Now, the father may not have intentionally abandoned the child. The father is divorcing the mother is divorcing the father, they're getting separated or whatever. It's not the father's intention to abandon the child, or the mother's intention to abandon, depending on who's got,
Hmm.
custody or whatever. Or even in a shared custody situation, it may not be the parents who are getting divorced. It may not be their intention to abandon the child, but the child nevertheless feels abandoned.
Mm.
There's nevertheless either physical abandonment because somebody has moved out of the house, they're not living together in the same house anymore, or emotional abandonment because they don't have access to the other partner, the other spouse, the other parent, they don't have as much access. They might just be a weekend father. So there's abandonment issues that need to be covered in that situation. And abandonment is very traumatic. It's not trauma as a result of abuse, it's
Of
trauma as a
abuse, right?
result of abandonment. But it's still
Right.
trauma.
Gotcha. Yeah, yeah.
And the result of trauma is, there are similar results of trauma, whether it's from abuse or abandonment. There are some similarities as a result of the trauma.
Right.
um, the trauma of childhood abuse has really long-term effects. And what I want to also talk about in the next segment is that it continues this long-term effect. When I say long-term effect, why am I saying that? Because the trauma of childhood abuse continues to shape my sense of self, and it continues to shape my world. Even if I have new experiences, or even if I get into a new relationship, even if the relationship is actually healthy, say I get into a new relationship and that person treats me so well, respects, loves me, it's a healthy relationship. I am not going to bring in a healthy part of me because I have not been healed from the trauma abuse. And everything that I see, even in the healthy relationship, even in the new person, the new partner, the new relationship, is through a filter of abuse trauma. I already have a filter. Filter has to be replaced. And I really want to talk about that as well in the segments going forward. We might need 2 more segments plus this one, because there's so much there, or we may not. We may be able to finish it in the next one. So I'm going to leave that to you, Greg. But, you know, one of the most tragic consequences of this trauma abuse, its impact on my interpersonal relationship. It disrupts healthy development. Try to sort of round it up right now. Disrupts healthy childhood brain development, disrupts healthy relationship, causes us to have an unhealthy, toxic pattern of continuing to be attracted to abusive people, like as if we deserve nothing but abuse. But that's exactly what a trauma abuse survivor will tell you. I don't deserve any
Mm.
better. And they will make excuses for the abuser. Oh, he's had a rough childhood. If he's abusing me, if he's beating me up, or if he's verbally bashing me up, or if he's mentally abusing me, you don't know. That's nothing compared to what he's been through. He's had he's an alcoholic. They always make excuses for this person because they don't think they deserve anything better. They do not anymore. They do not any longer know how to recognize what is healthy. So they make
Mm.
excuses for what is not healthy. For many survivors, understanding how the effects of trauma manifest in interpersonal relationship is one of the most important steps, a step toward creating greater self-awareness and starting the healing process. The first thing a survivor of trauma abuse, I'm going to talk about all of this in the next segment, but really the first thing a survivor of trauma abuse needs to do is in understanding how the effects of trauma is understanding how the effects of trauma has affected their relationship. How has my trauma from my childhood, my teenagehood, or even my former relationships in adulthood, how has that impacted negatively my current relationship or relationships? You have to have that self-awareness to say, this is not just some random relationship I've entered into, and this is not it's not becoming unhealthy randomly. It's because I am not healed. I have brought my trauma into this relationship, and either it's causing me to manipulate the relationship and become the abuser. A trauma victim of trauma abuse can also become an abuser.
Mm.
Or I don't know how to recognize what is healthy. I'm allowing more abuse to be perpetrated on me, and I'm getting re-traumatized. If the survivor of trauma abuse can just stop everything and go, I know why this is happening. I was traumatized. So now I'm here and I'm not able to even know what is healthy in order for me to have boundaries, because if I know what's healthy and what's not healthy, I can have boundaries and say, you can't treat me that way. You cannot talk to me that way. I deserve better. So what does the survivor do? The survivor now has to, it's almost like skills training. It's almost like skills training. The survivor has to go to a trauma abuse counselor, an abuse trauma counselor, a PTSD counselor, a counselor that specializes in trauma and overcoming trauma, and get skills training on how to navigate your interpersonal relationships as it is now, how to navigate it, how to self-care, how to protect yourself, how to recognize what is healthy and what is not healthy. That's training right there.
Mm.
That's actually, it's part of applying a boundary. Nobody's born with boundaries. I've said that before in our boundary podcast. Nobody's born with boundaries. You learn how to apply a boundary. You learn what a boundary looks like. You learn how to apply it, and then you learn how to implement consequences for boundary violations. This is a skills training thing. Learning how to apply a boundary is a skill. It is actually a skill. There's an art to it. There's a science to it. And learning how to self-care is a skill. It's an art. It's a learning self-awareness. So go to a counselor or a therapist who specializes in trauma and abuse and again, abuse trauma or abandonment issues or borderline, or somebody that specializes in borderline personality disorders or narcissistic personality disorders, and get a set of skills on how to navigate your interpersonal relationships. Get help on how to remove your unhealthy, toxic filters that, because I've always been a victim of trauma, I don't deserve anything better. So get rid of that filter. Put on a new filter. How do you see yourself? My thing is, you have to see yourself through the eyes of God. You have to. That is the only filter that will work. Then it will propel you to self-love. The God filter, you will have to self-love. You'll have to love yourself. You'll have to treat yourself better. You have to forgive yourself for mistakes. He does. So much.
Yeah, I think that's good. Is there anything else that you want to leave us with on this first part of the discussion? Obviously, the vast majority of the how-tos and the help and how to stop the cycle and that sort of thing is what we're going to be discussing next time.
Yes.
But as we're finishing up here, is there anything that you want to leave the listeners with, the viewers with? So grateful for your time and for unpacking this. I know you've got a burden for this, which is why you wanted to discuss this. You got a burden for those who experiencing abuse.
Yeah. Even in this particular segment, this particular segment on how to recognize abuse trauma, I haven't even finished all of that. So we will discuss on how we're going to put it together on, do I finish how to other things to recognize in a survivor of abuse trauma. I think that is very important. And then go into how to heal, how to start your healing journey, what to do to get better self-awareness. I would like to leave this thought with the listeners, the viewers of this particular podcast on abuse trauma, is that please don't forget that human beings are innately social beings. We were created to be social. We were not created to live on an island all by ourselves or to be alone. Even the most melancholy of us all, I know you think you may have been created to live on an island. You're not. Okay? But human beings are innately social beings. And from the time we are born, our identity and our ability to make sense of our world around us is continuously shaped by one thing: our social interaction. Our social interactions with everybody is what continues to shape it continues to help our ability to make sense of the world around us. And the most significant of these interactions, not all the time, but most of the time, for the most part, the most significant of these interactions typically occur in childhood. So there's children among us, whether it's at home, in our neighborhood, in our places of worship, where we work, if we work with children. Let's remember what we give our children has long-term effects. How we interact with them, what we do for them, what we withhold, what we provide has long-term effects on how they will socially interact and on healthy relationships or sadly unhealthy relationships they may get into. And if parents can get a hold of the effects of, I'm sure there are many parents that will watch this podcast. If you have children and you're a busy mother or a busy father, which is so understandable in today's world, that one job, two jobs, you're busy, you're trying to make ends meet, your intentions are good. But understand that if you have children, you are a caregiver. And your attachment to that child through that caregiving must take precedence over anything else you're doing, whether in ministry or in your work or whatever. Your children's well-being, emotional and mental and spiritual well-being of your child, your son, your daughter, must be prioritized. It just grieves me. I don't counsel children. I'm not a child psychologist. I'm a psychologist. My therapy is primarily for adults. I counsel adults. Anyone above 18, that's who I counsel, just in case you're wondering. I'm an adult psychologist. But I have counseled so many parents, and many of them are wonderful. They love their kids. Some are just frustrated and angry, not with the kids, with the world. And if they are not going to get it together, then there is going to be trauma that the child will experience. If it's not through abuse, it might be through abandonment or neglect, or just, you can emotionally neglect your child. You could be present physically, but if you're not interacting socially with that child, you are emotionally neglecting that child. Don't just buy the child a PlayStation and expect that child to be okay with it. The child will tell you that that's what they want. The child might say, I'm perfectly okay with it. I'd rather this than talk to anybody else. Don't just leave them to their own devices. Family meals are important. I don't know why we don't do that as much, but family meals where all of us eat together are important. Talking to your children, spending quality time, even if it is 10 minutes of quality time at the end of your busy day, is going to provide a healthy mindset for that child, that I am important. Even to my busy parents, I am important. I'm not unimportant. The child will grow up and the child will be able to recognize an unhealthy, toxic individual a mile away, because the child knows what's healthy from that child's home. Healthy relationships and healthy interactions start at home. Start at home when the child is still young. And if the parent watching this says, well, I've messed up, I didn't do that, my child is now 15, it's not too late. It's not too late to start when your child is 15. From the moment the child was a toddler to 15, maybe, you got too busy and maybe you didn't do some of the things that we discussed today. It's not too late. If the child is 18, it's not too late. Don't let it get too late. Spend time. You are creating an entire, you are making history for that child. And you are creating a safe environment that when that child is not in a safe place in her life or his life, when that child is 30 or 40 and they find themselves in an unsafe place, the child will immediately be able to compare what the safety you gave them and will be able to say, I'm not going to put up with that. That's not safe. That's not healthy. And the child will protect themselves. You know why many people, many adults don't self-care? Because they don't know what self-care even looks like. They don't know what it looks like. They've never been cared for, so they don't know what self-care looks like. Or they think they're not worth it, even if they mentally might know what it looks like. They've not experienced care from their primary caregivers, their parents, grandparents, or siblings, or whatever. So they don't know what it looks like. They'll take any old thing from anybody. And I'm sorry, I wanted to just leave a small thought with you, but it became a whole paragraph.
That was so good. If you stuck around for the end, wow. I mean, that will change your life as a parent. That was tremendous, and thank you for sharing that, and for sharing it with the passion that it deserves, because it's so important. It's so important. We're molding their future.
Well,
Really are.
Greg, you are a good parent. I know that because I saw it in front of my own eyes. You and Steph, your wife, are good parents. No matter how busy you get, no matter how busy you are, it may not be every day, but for the most part, at least when they're going to bed or when you sleep, you spend some time talking to them, showing them some love, even if it's for a few minutes. You are there for them. And you and Stephanie have built fences around your daughters. You have built a fence of safety and love. They will grow up recognizing a mile away what is safe and what is unsafe, and it will keep them it will keep their world and their social interactions and their relationships healthy for a long time. You're doing them the greatest favor. You're giving them the greatest gift of all. That is the gift of yourself, your time, your love, your validation, your presence, your words, your care. Nothing can take that place. And they will repeat it. When they are mothers, when your daughters one day are mothers themselves and wives, they will repeat that healthy cycle because they know what it looks like. They know the effects of a healthy relationship with their father and mother. They know what it looks like. But there are millions of children in North America, around the world, even in Malaysia where I am, that do not know what it looks like. And yes, it is my heartbeat to help somebody stop that cycle, stop that pattern, be a cycle breaker. If there's a cycle in your family, whether it came from your father, your mother, I'm not talking about you personally, Greg, but all of us. If there's a cycle in my own family, whether it came from my grandfather or father, just an unhealthy pattern of behavior, I need to wake up and be the cycle breaker. Break that cycle. And then those that come after me, whether it's my children or whoever I'm mentoring, there will be a new pattern, a new generation, a new cycle. We are under the delusion that we think that cycles are hard to break. Well, actually, some cycles are a bit difficult to break, but they're not impossible to break. It is a cop-out. You're quitting on yourself and on God, on His supernatural power. If you think that some cycles cannot be broken, can be. You can be the cycle breaker.
I think we're gonna leave it. We're gonna leave it with that for this first part. And I want to thank you so much for your time and for sharing that with us. And we look forward to part 2 of this discussion. And who knows how many parts there'll be. Hopefully we can get it done in 2, but we'll see if we'll need more. We'll see you all next time.
I have a feeling we may need more than 2, but not more than 3, I think. But you never know. I might be able to do it in the next one. Thank you so much, Greg. I've always enjoyed it. Such a pleasure to be on Heka Podcast.
Well, we'll see you all next time for part 2 of this discussion with Dr. Marshall. God bless you.